Welcome to the Dope Dive, brought to you today by Safety One Source. For all you safety professionals, risk managers, and, well, anyone out there really committed to building a safer work environment, we're tackling a really critical issue today, understanding and navigating OSHA's regulations on lead exposure in construction. It's a hazard that definitely demands our close attention.
Absolutely, it really does. And to help everyone get a handle on this, we've pulled together, a range of essential resources. Think of it as your shortcut to the key information. We're diving into the OSHA lead in construction standard itself. That's 29 CFR 1926.62, and also looking at crucial interpretations from OSHA officials, plus guidelines for medical surveillance. Our goal in this deep dive is really to synthesize this info, making it clear what your responsibilities are as employers and what protections workers are entitled to.
Okay, great. So let's get right to it then. The cornerstone, I suppose, of these regulations is understanding the limits OSHA sets for lead exposure, that's the permissible exposure limit, or PEL, and the action level. What's the significance of these two thresholds for us?
Right. So the permissible exposure limit, the PEL, that's the absolute maximum allowed, is set at 50 micrograms of lead per cubic meter of air, averaged over an 8-hour workday. So if your workers aren't exceeding this, you're technically within the legal limit. But here's a crucial point, especially for managing varied schedules. Construction work often goes beyond just an 8-hour day, right?
Right, exactly. So that 50 GM3, that isn't a flat limit regardless of how long the workday is.
Correct. No, it's not. For any workday longer than 8 hours, the standard actually has a specific formula to adjust that allowable exposure downwards. It's 400 divided by the total number of hours worked in that day. So let's say for a 10-hour shift, the PL actually drops down to 40 GM3. That time-weighted average, the TWA, it's really fundamental to ensuring compliance, particularly when you're dealing with those longer shifts common in construction.
Okay, that makes sense. And then we have the action level, which is set lower. What role does that play for safety professionals?
Good question. The action level is set at 30 micrograms of lead per cubic meter of air, again, as an 8-hour TWA. You should think of this as sort of an early warning signal. When employee exposure hits or goes above this level, it doesn't mean you're in violation yet, but, and this is key, it does trigger a whole cascade of other crucial requirements.
Ah, okay. Like what kind of requirements?
Well, this includes things like mandatory exposure monitoring, setting up medical surveillance programs, and providing comprehensive employee training. It's basically your cue to ramp up those preventative measures.
That makes perfect sense. So the action level is our trigger point for kicking in more intensive safety protocols. Now, how do safety professionals actually figure out if their workers are being exposed at or above these levels? That's where the initial exposure assessment comes in, I assume.
Correct. Yeah, the standard requires employers to first determine if any employee could be exposed above that action level. And this initial assessment, this initial look, needs to be done assuming no respirators are being used. It's a look at the potential raw exposure.
So it's kind of like an unprotected worker baseline assessment.
Precisely. Yeah. Now, here's a bit of flexibility the standard offers. You don't always have to start right out with air sampling. You can sometimes use what's called objective data.
Objective data? What falls under that?
Well, this could be information maybe from your insurance carrier or industry trade groups. Sometimes material suppliers can provide data on lead content and potential release, or even your own historical sampling data from similar tasks, provided it was done within the last 12 months. This can potentially save time and resources if you have good, relevant existing data.
That sounds efficient, but I imagine there are strings attached to relying on objective data like that.
Oh, absolutely. The key here is meticulous record keeping. You need really solid documentation that clearly demonstrates how that objective data directly applies to the current job conditions and the specific tasks being done. If that link isn't, rock solid, you definitely face scrutiny. And maybe more importantly, objective data cannot be used for certain high-risk tasks that are explicitly listed in the standard under 1926.62D2.
Why enough for those tasks?
Because those activities just inherently carry a much greater risk of significant lead exposure, so direct assessment, actual monitoring is required for those.
Okay. And for those specific high-risk tasks where objective data isn't allowed up front, what immediate protective measures are required then?
Right. For those specific tasks, the standard mandates what's called interim protection. This means you need to immediately put in place respiratory protection, provide protective clothing and change areas, ensure hand-washing facilities are available, initiate biological monitoring, and deliver thorough training before you even have definitive exposure data showing levels below the PEL.
Could you remind us of some of those tasks that automatically trigger this interim protection? Just for our listeners.
Certainly. Yeah, these include activities like manual demolition, scraping, and sanding of surfaces coated with lead-based paint, using heat guns to strip paint, and also power tool cleaning, even when using dust collection systems. Now, here's a very specific point that came out in a 1999 OSHA interpretation, which is pretty useful for safety pros dealing with coatings.
Okay.
In a very limited circumstance, objective data might actually be usable even for some of these tasks, specifically power tool cleaning with dust collection, manual demolition, scraping, and sanding. But only if the lead content in the paint is extremely low, like 0.06% or less. That aligns with the CPSC's definition of non-lead containing paint. In those very narrow cases, you can estimate airborne lead levels by multiplying the total airborne dust concentration by the percentage of lead in the paint.
But that sounds like a very specific exception.
It is, and it's critical OSHA made it clear that this doesn't exempt you from any other part of the standard or the ultimate need for a proper exposure assessment if there's really any doubt. It's quite narrow.
Gotcha. That's a really nuanced but important exception to be aware of. What about other high-risk activities where this exception definitely doesn't apply?
Right. So for tasks like spray painting with lead paint, working with lead-containing mortar, lead burning, rivet busting, power tool cleaning without dust collection, any dry abrasive cleanup, moving or removing abrasive blasting enclosures, abrasive blasting itself, and any welding, cutting, or torch burning on lead-containing coatings for all of those, that interim protection is immediately required. No question. These methods are just much more likely to generate significant airborne lead.
Okay, that's clear. So once we've done that initial assessment, or maybe we're past the interim protection phase, how often do we need to keep monitoring exposure levels?
Good question. The frequency of your ongoing monitoring depends directly on the levels you actually find. So if exposures are at or above the action level, but they're still below the PEL, you need to monitor at least every 6 months. However, if your measurements show exposures above the PEL, that frequency jumps up to quarterly monitoring, so every 3 months.
How do you stop monitoring?
You can only stop this periodic monitoring after you have 2 consecutive measurements, taken at least 7 days apart, that are both below the action level.
And I assume if anything changes in our work processes or the environment, that would require more monitoring too.
Absolutely, yes. Any change in equipment, work processes, the engineering controls you've put in place, personnel involved, or if you introduce new tasks that could potentially affect lead exposure, you're obligated to conduct additional monitoring. It's all about ensuring your initial assessment remains accurate and your controls are still effective.
Communication is always key in safety. What are our responsibilities when it comes to letting employees know about their monitoring results?
Yeah, communication is vital here. You are required to notify your employees in writing of the results of their specific exposure monitoring within 5 working days of you receiving those results. And if the monitoring shows an exposure at or above the PEL, you also have to inform the employee of this exceedance and clearly describe the corrective actions you have taken or are planning to take to bring those exposure levels down.
And to make sure we're relying on sound data, are there specific requirements for the accuracy of the methods we use for monitoring?
Yes, definitely. The standard specifies that your monitoring methods must be accurate to within plus or minus 25%, at or above the action level of 30 GM3. And this accuracy needs to be demonstrated with a 95% confidence level. This basically ensures that the measurements you're taking are reliable enough to base important safety decisions on.
Now, in our research, we also came across information about XRF analyzers, X-ray fluorescence, right? How do they fit into this whole picture of lead exposure assessment for safety professionals?
That's a really great point to clarify. A 2014 OSHA interpretation specifically addressed the role of XRF analyzers. OSHA acknowledges that XRF is a valuable screening tool. It can definitely help you quickly identify surfaces that have higher lead concentrations. And this information can then be really useful for you as safety professionals in developing your worst-case exposure scenarios and strategically planning where to focus maybe more intensive airborne monitoring.
Okay, so helpful for targeting,
But, and this is absolutely critical for compliance, OSHA does not consider bulk or surface sample analysis alone, and that includes XRF results as sufficient to predict actual airborne lead exposure levels in the breathing zone of your workers. And therefore, it's not sufficient to determine compliance with the OSHA standards. You still need that airborne monitoring or, that reliable objective data as the primary basis for your compliance decisions.
So XRF is a helpful tool for maybe identifying potential hazards or prioritizing, but it doesn't replace the need to actually measure what workers are inhaling. That's a really important distinction for us to remember. Okay, let's shift gears now to what we need to do once we've identified a lead exposure risk. This falls under methods of compliance, right?
Correct, yes. The standard clearly lays out a hierarchy of controls. Engineering controls and work practice controls, which also include administrative controls. These are the primary methods you, as employers, must implement first to reduce and maintain employee exposure below the PL. Respirators, they're only to be used as a supplementary measure when these feasible controls aren't enough on their own to achieve that level of protection.
And if there's a potential for exposures to reach the PL, we need a formal plan in place beforehand.
Yes, absolutely. Before you even begin any job where employee exposures could reach the PEL as an 8-hour TWA, you are required to develop and implement a comprehensive written compliance program. This program needs to be a detailed roadmap, essentially. It has to include a thorough description of all the lead-emitting activities involved, the specific engineering and work practice controls you'll be using, any technologies you've considered for reducing exposure, all relevant air monitoring data you have, a clear schedule for implementing these controls, the specific work practices your employees will follow, any administrative controls like job rotation if you're using them, how you're coordinating with contractors on multi-employer sites, and importantly, a requirement for an annual review and update of this entire program to make sure it stays effective and relevant.
You mentioned mechanical ventilation and job rotation as control methods. How do safety professionals typically use these?
Right. Mechanical ventilation is a key engineering control. Properly designed and crucially maintained ventilation systems can effectively capture and remove airborne lead contaminants right at the source, which significantly reduces worker exposure. You need to regularly evaluate the performance of these systems too to make sure they're actually working as intended. Job rotation, on the other hand, that's an administrative control. By strategically rotating employees through tasks that have different exposure levels, you can limit the total time any single employee is exposed to higher concentrations of lead, thereby helping to keep their overall time-weighted average exposure below the PEL.
And beyond these specific controls, are there just general good work habits that we should be emphasizing on site?
Absolutely. Appendix B of the standard itself is basically a treasure trove of recommended good work practices. As safety professionals, you should be thoroughly familiar with these and ensure they are consistently followed by all employees. They cover a really wide range of essential practices, from personal hygiene to the proper handling and disposal of lead-containing materials, all aimed at minimizing the potential for exposure.
Okay, so if those primary controls, engineering work practices aren't sufficient, or maybe in those initial interim protection scenarios we talked about, respirators become necessary. What are the key things safety professionals need to know about respiratory protection under the standard?
Right, respirators. They are required in several situations. Definitely when employee exposure exceeds the PLL. Also when engineering and work practice controls aren't feasible enough to bring exposures down below the PL. Or even if an employee simply requests one for added protection, maybe they just feel more comfortable. And it's really important to remember that the employer is responsible for paying for these respirators. No cost to the employee.
And there are specific standards for the types of respirators we can use, right? Not just any dust mask.
Oh, absolutely not. Any respirator you provide must be NIOSH approved under 42 CFR Part 84. This ensures the respirator has met specific performance standards for filtration and other critical factors. The selection of the appropriate respirator depends on the specific level of lead exposure measured or anticipated. The standard actually references sections in the General Industry Respiratory Standard, 1910.134, and within 1926.62 itself, that detail the necessary protection factors for different exposure levels. As an employer, you always have the option to provide a more protective respirator, like a powered air purifying respirator or ABR. And employees even have the right to request a APR if they prefer it over, say, a negative pressure type.
Okay, but simply handing out the respirator isn't enough, though. We need a whole program to back it up, don't we?
Exactly. You can't just hand them out. As safety professionals, you need to establish and maintain a comprehensive respiratory protection program. This has to include written procedures for proper selection, fit testing, which can be either qualitative or quantitative, use, cleaning, storage, and maintenance of the respirators. Thorough training for employees on how to correctly use their respirators and understand their limitations is also absolutely crucial. The standard also mandates that employees be allowed to change their respirator filters. If they experience increased resistance to breathing, they shouldn't have to struggle. Additionally, they need to be able to periodically wash their face and the respirator itself to prevent skin irritation. Finally, and this is important, if an employee reports difficulty breathing during fit testing or while actually using a respirator on the job, a medical evaluation must be made available to determine if they can safely use that type of respirator.
Okay, that covers breathing protection. Let's shift our focus now to protecting the body from direct contact with lead. What are the requirements for protective work clothing and equipment that safety professionals need to be aware of?
Right. Protective clothing and equipment are required whenever employees are exposed above the PAL.
Yeah.
Also, if there's a potential for skin or eye irritation from specific lead compounds like lead arsenate or lead azide. And as we mentioned, during those initial interim protection phases before exposure levels are fully known. Again, as the employer, you are obligated to provide all necessary protective clothing and equipment at absolutely no cost to your employees.
What specific types of clothing and equipment are we typically talking about here?
This usually includes items like coveralls or other full-body workwear, gloves suitable for the task, head coverings or hats, shoe covers or maybe disposable boot covers, and depending on the specific task and potential for splashes or flying particles. Face shields or vented safety goggles might also be required.
And maintaining the cleanliness of this protective gear is obviously critical. What are the regulations around cleaning and replacement?
Absolutely critical. Protective clothing must be provided to employees clean and dry, at least on a weekly basis. However, if the airborne lead exposure exceeds 200 GM3, then clean clothing must be provided daily. As safety professionals, you're also responsible for ensuring that any damaged clothing is properly repaired or replaced. The standard also mandates the proper cleaning, laundering, or disposal of contaminated clothing. It's crucial to establish clear work practices for how employees should put on and take off contaminated clothing to minimize the dispersal of lead dust.
Like what kind of practices?
Well, this might include procedures like using a HEPA vacuum on heavily contaminated garments before removal, removing shoe covers while still within the designated work area, carefully removing coveralls, and immediately washing hands and face after removing all protective gear. Any contaminated clothing that needs to be cleaned or disposed of must be placed in closed containers. And these containers need to be clearly labeled with a specific hazard warning. It's quite detailed. Danger: clothing and equipment contaminated with lead may damage fertility or the unborn child, causes damage to the central nervous system. You get the idea. It's serious. You also have a responsibility to inform any laundry personnel, and this must be done in writing, about the potential hazards of lead exposure from handling these items.
Wow, okay. It's really clear that preventing the spread of lead contamination beyond the immediate work area is a major, major concern. This leads us nicely into the requirements for hygiene facilities and practices. What does OSHA mandate in this area for safety professionals to implement?
Yeah, the standard has very specific rules here, all aimed at preventing the ingestion of lead, which is a major pathway for exposure. So, eating, drinking, smoking, and applying cosmetics are strictly forbidden in any areas where employees are exposed above the PAL. Full stop. As employers, you must provide clean change areas for employees, and these must have separate storage facilities for their work clothes and their street clothes. Keep them apart. This is required in areas where exposure is above the PAL and also during those interim protection phases we discussed. Where it's feasible, and OSHA generally considers it feasible on most construction sites, you must also provide shower facilities for employees who are exposed above the PAL. And you need to ensure that they actually use these showers at the end of their work shift. You have to provide appropriate cleansing agents and clean towels too.
What about lunch breaks?
Right. Clean lunchroom or eating areas are also a requirement. These need to be separate from the work areas. And employees should not be permitted to enter these eating areas while wearing their protective work clothing unless any visible surface lead dust has been thoroughly removed first, maybe by HEPA vacuuming. Finally, you need to ensure that adequate hand washing facilities, as specified in the General Sanitation Standard 1926.51, are readily available. And employees must be required to wash their hands and faces thoroughly at the end of each shift, especially in situations where shower facilities might not be available for some reason.
Maintaining good personal hygiene on site is absolutely critical when dealing with lead, it sounds like. What about the general cleanliness of the work environment itself? That falls under housekeeping, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. As safety professionals, you are responsible for developing and implementing a comprehensive housekeeping program. The goal is explicitly stated.
Yeah.
To keep all surfaces in the workplace as free as practicable from accumulations of lead dust. The preferred method for cleaning is definitely vacuuming, using HEPA filtered vacuums. High-efficiency particulate air filters are key. It's also important to have a procedure for emptying these vacuums that minimizes the potential for lead dust to, re-enter the work environment. Careful handling is needed.
What about compressed air? We see that used for cleaning sometimes.
Generally, no. The use of compressed air for cleaning lead dust is prohibited unless it's used in conjunction with a ventilation system specifically designed to contain and capture the dust that gets blown around. Otherwise, it just spreads the contamination. Similarly, dry or wet sweeping, shoveling, or brushing should also be avoided unless vacuuming or other equally effective methods have been tried first and found to be genuinely ineffective for that specific situation.
Okay. The standard uses that phrase as free as practicable. Is there any further guidance on what that practically means for us as safety professionals managing work sites? It sounds a bit vague.
That's a really important question, and yeah, it can seem a bit vague. The standard itself is somewhat performance-oriented in this regard and doesn't set specific numerical limits for lead dust on all surfaces. However, OSHA has provided guidance over the years, often referencing the Department of Housing and Urban Development's HUD lead dust clearance level, specifically the 200 micrograms per square foot ClearF level, particularly for floors and change areas, storage rooms, and lunchrooms. While that 200 micrograms isn't a strict legal requirement across the board under the OSHA standard, it serves as a really good benchmark to aim for when considering what is practicable in those types of areas.
What about other surfaces, like maybe overhead beams or rafters?
For other surfaces, like rafters or less frequently contacted areas, the focus is more on having regular cleaning schedules and using methods that effectively prevent the re-entrainment of settled lead dust back into the air where workers can breathe it. Ultimately, OSHA compliant safety and health officers, or CSHOs, will evaluate the effectiveness of your housekeeping program based on factors like the potential for exposure from those contaminated surfaces and the specific characteristics of your worksite. Is dust accumulating where it could become airborne again?
And if physically cleaning some areas is really difficult or maybe not always the most effective approach, are there alternative methods that are acceptable under the standard?
Yes. The standard explicitly states that alternative methods are acceptable if they reliably prevent lead dust from becoming a source of employee exposure. So things like effectively sealing lead-containing materials in place, using encapsulants, for example, can be acceptable compliance methods. The primary goal, at the end of the day, is to prevent the accumulation and dispersal of lead dust, regardless of the specific method you choose to achieve that.
Okay. Now, even with all these preventative measures in place controls, hygiene, housekeeping, the standard also requires medical surveillance. What's the fundamental purpose of this from a safety and health perspective?
Right. Medical surveillance serves as a really critical secondary layer of protection. It's not a replacement for control, but a supplement. Its purpose is really threefold. First, to complement your exposure controls and help detect any failures in those controls. Are people still getting exposed? Second, to protect the reproductive health of your workers, both male and female, as lead is a known reproductive toxin. And third, to identify any individual workers who may be particularly susceptible to the effects of lead or who might be experiencing higher than anticipated levels of exposure despite your control efforts. And it's crucial to remember all required medical surveillance must be conducted by or under the direct supervision of a licensed physician. And, like respirators and PPE, it must be provided to employees at absolutely no cost to them.
What specific conditions or exposure levels trigger the requirement for an employee to be included in a medical surveillance program?
There are two main triggers that require inclusion. First, if an employee is exposed to lead at or above the action level, that's the 30 organo level, for more than 30 days in any consecutive 12-month period. Second, inclusion is required if an employee's blood lead level, their BLL, is found to be 40 micrograms per deciliter or higher at any time. Additionally, there's a requirement for initial biological monitoring that involves both a blood lead test and a ZPP, or zinc protoporphyrin test. This initial testing is mandatory for any employee who is exposed above the action level on even a single day.
Wow, even one day above the action level triggers that initial blood test.
Yes, that initial biological monitoring is triggered by just 1 day of exposure at or above the action level. The ongoing surveillance program participation kicks in with the 30-plus days or the elevated BLL.
Okay. And how frequently do these biological monitoring tests, the blood tests, need to be conducted for employees who are in the medical surveillance program?
All right. For those employees who meet the criteria exposed above AL for 30-plus days a year, or BLL 40 year Gildel, their blood lead levels must be monitored at least every 2 months for the first 6 months they're in the program, or after their BLL hits 40. After that initial 6-month period, the frequency could be reduced to every 6 months, but only if their blood lead level consistently remains below 40 RDL. However, if an employee's blood lead level reaches 40 RDL or higher again, the monitoring frequency must be increased back to every 2 months. And it stays at every 2 months until they have 2 consecutive blood tests, taken at least 7 days apart, that show levels below 40 Erg-Gedel again.
What about employees removed from exposure?
Good point. For any employee who has been temporarily removed from lead exposure due to an elevated blood lead level, monitoring must occur on a monthly basis during the entire period of their removal. Also, if an initial blood lead test result comes back at or above the medical removal trigger, which is 50 Erg-Gedel, a follow-up blood test must be conducted within 2 weeks to confirm that result.
And the lab's doing these tests. Any requirements there?
Yes, very important. The standard specifies strict accuracy requirements for the laboratories performing blood lead level analysis. They must be OSHA approved for this type of analysis. And finally, related to communication, you are obligated to notify your employees in writing of their blood lead level results within 5 working days of receiving them from the lab. If an employee's blood lead level is 50 Chicory-L or higher, you must also inform them about the medical removal protection procedures, which we'll discuss next.
Okay. Beyond these regular blood tests, are there also requirements for full medical examinations under the standard?
Yes, there are specific requirements for more comprehensive medical examinations as well. An annual medical examination is mandatory for any employee who had a blood lead level of 40 TDL or higher at any point in the preceding 12 months, and who was also exposed above the action level for more than 30 days during that same year. So it's a combination trigger. Pre-assignment medical examinations are also required before an employee is placed in a job where airborne lead concentrations are expected to reach or exceed the action level for more than 30 days per year. Additionally, an examination must be provided as soon as feasible if an employee reports any signs or symptoms that might be associated with lead poisoning, or if an employee requests medical advice regarding the potential effects of lead exposure on their ability to procreate, or if an employee informs you that they're pregnant, or if an employee experiences any difficulties with breathing during respirator fit testing or while using a respirator on the job. And finally, medical examination is also required for any employee who has been removed from lead exposure due to medical reasons, either high BLL or a physician's determination.
What are the typical components of these pre-assignment and annual medical exams that our listeners, the safety pros, should be aware are happening?
Both the pre-assignment and the annual medical examinations must include several key components: a comprehensive collection of the employee's work history and medical history, focusing on potential past exposures and relevant health conditions; a thorough physical examination with a specific focus on the pulmonary system if the employee uses respirators; measurement of blood pressure; a battery of specific blood tests, including, of course, the blood lead level, BLL, but also hemoglobin, hematocrit, red cell indices, a peripheral blood smear review, ZPP, blood urea nitrogen, BUN, and serum creatinine to check kidney function, a routine urinalysis, and importantly, any other tests that the examining physician deems medically necessary based on the individual's history and presentation. The standard also requires that pregnancy testing and evaluations of male fertility must be made available to employees if they request it.
It sounds quite thorough. What happens if an employee disagrees with the findings of the company-chosen physician? Do they have recourse?
Yes, they do. The standard includes a provision for what's called a multiple physician review mechanism. If there is a disagreement between the physician selected by the employer and a physician designated by the employee, both parties can then jointly agree to select a third independent physician to review the case, look at all the findings, and provide a final binding medical opinion.
That's good to know. Now, what specific information are employers required to provide to the physician who will be conducting these examinations?
That's crucial for the physician to make an informed assessment. As the employer, you are obligated to provide the examining physician with several things: a copy of the OSHA lead and construction standard and its appendices, so they understand the regulatory context; a detailed description of the employee's specific job duties, especially as they relate to potential lead exposure; information on the employee's typical and anticipated levels of lead exposure for those tasks; information on the type of personal protective equipment, particularly respirators, that the employee is required to use; the employee's prior blood lead level test results, if any exist; and copies of any previous written medical opinions that have been issued regarding that specific employee's lead exposure.
Okay, and then what kind of information will the employer receive back from the examining physician after the evaluation? Is it the full medical report?
No, not the full report. The physician will provide a written medical opinion to the employer, but its contents are strictly defined to protect employee privacy. This opinion must include the physician's assessment of whether the employee has any detected medical condition which would place them at increased risk of health impairment from lead exposure. It must include any recommended limitations on the employee's exposure to lead or on their use of respirators, including an assessment of their ability to use different types, like PPRs. And it must include a statement that the employee has been informed by the physician of the results of the medical examination and any medical conditions resulting from lead exposure that require further explanation or treatment. Crucially, the physician is specifically instructed not to disclose any other findings or diagnoses unrelated to occupational lead exposure to the employer in this written opinion.
So, protecting the employee's broader medical privacy.
Exactly. The physician is, however, required to directly advise the employee of any medical conditions they may have, related or unrelated to lead, that would require further evaluation or treatment. It's also really important to note here that the standard strictly prohibits the routine use of what's called prophylactic chelation, using chelating drugs to prevent lead poisoning. That's forbidden. Therapeutic or diagnostic chelation is only permitted under the direct supervision of a licensed physician in a controlled clinical setting with appropriate medical monitoring, and only after the employee has been fully informed in writing about the procedure and its risks.
Okay. All of these measures are clearly aimed at preventing harm, but what happens if, despite best efforts, an employee's blood lead level does get too high? That's where medical removal protection, or MRP, comes into play, doesn't it?
That's correct. Medical removal protection, MRP, is a really critical safety net within the standard. It mandates that an employee must be temporarily removed from any work where their exposure to lead is at or above the action level if their blood lead level reaches 50 GAL or higher, and that elevated level is confirmed by a second follow-up blood test within 2 weeks. Medical removal is also required if a final medical determination, maybe from that multiple physician review process, concludes that the employee faces an increased risk to their health from continued lead exposure, regardless of their exact BLL at that moment.
And what happens to the employee's job and pay during this removal period?
This is the core of MRP. During this period of medical removal, the employer is obligated to maintain the employee's regular earnings, their seniority, and all other employment rights and benefits as if they hadn't been removed. This protection lasts for up to a maximum of 18 months for each instance of medical removal.
18 months, okay. And under what conditions can an employee who has been medically removed return to their regular job duties involving lead exposure?
An employee who was removed specifically due to an elevated blood lead level, CAFAF-defined TDL, can return to their former job status once they have 2 consecutive blood tests, taken at least a week apart, that show their lead level has dropped below 40 vointiel. For employees who are removed based on a medical determination of increased health risk, they can return to work when a subsequent medical determination indicates that they no longer face that elevated health risk from lead exposure.
It sounds like employers might have some leeway to provide these protections, even in situations where they aren't strictly mandated by those specific BLL triggers.
Yes, that's an interesting point in the standard. While it sets specific triggers for mandatory MRP, it also explicitly states that employers may choose to provide MRP benefits, even in situations where they are not strictly required by the standard. This could include, for example, cases of voluntary removal initiated by the employee due to concerns about lead, or perhaps situations where an employee experiences health effects believed to be related to lead exposure, but doesn't quite meet the specific blood lead level criteria for mandatory removal. The standard also addresses how MRP benefits should be coordinated with any workers' compensation claims or other compensation programs, basically to prevent the employee from receiving double payment for the same lost earnings.
Gotcha. Okay, moving on to communication again. Clear communication of these hazards and the protections in place is also absolutely essential for a successful safety program. What are the training and information requirements under the lead in construction standard that safety pros need to manage?
Absolutely essential. As safety professionals, you are required to have a comprehensive hazard communication program in place that specifically addresses lead. This integrates with the general HAZCOM standard. This includes ensuring that all containers of lead-containing materials are properly labeled and that safety data sheets, SDS, for those materials are readily accessible to employees. Additionally, you must provide thorough training to your employees. This training needs to be in accordance with both the Hazard Communication Standard, HCS requirements, and the specific additional requirements laid out in the LEED standard itself. This training must cover the various health hazards associated with lead exposure and be specific, including its potential to cause reproductive and developmental toxicity, damage to the central nervous system, kidney problems, and blood disorders, as well as its acute toxic effects.
Who is required to receive this specific lead training, and how often does it need to be provided?
Any employee who is exposed to lead at or above the action level on any single day must receive this training. Also, any employee who works with specific lead compounds that could cause skin or eye irritation, regardless of the airborne level, must also be trained. This training must be provided before the employee's initial work assignment involving potential lead exposure, and then it needs to be repeated at least annually thereafter, for as long as their exposure continues to be at or above the action level, or they continue working with those irritant compounds.
What specific information must be included in this comprehensive lead safety training? What are the key topics?
It's quite detailed. The training must cover the full content of the OSHA Lead in Construction Standard 1926.62 and its appendices. Employees need to know the rules. It needs to detail the specific work operations on your job site that could result in lead exposure above the action level. Make it site-specific. It must cover the proper use and, importantly, the limitations of respirators they might be required to wear. A thorough explanation of the medical surveillance program and the medical removal protection program is required. This has to include discussing the adverse health effects, the reproductive effects, and the specific hazards lead poses to a fetus. There are extra precautions for pregnant employees mentioned in the appendices. It needs to give a detailed overview of the engineering controls and work practices being used on that site to reduce lead exposure, explicitly including the good work practices outlined in Appendix B of the standard. If you have a written compliance plan, the contents of that plan must be explained. There needs to be a clear warning against the routine use of prophylactic chelation. We mentioned that earlier. And finally, a clear explanation of the employee's right to access their exposure and medical records under OSHA's Access to Employee Exposure and Medical Records Standard, 29 CFR 1910.1020. As an employer, you're also required to make a copy of the complete lead standard and its appendices readily available to all affected employees and provide any requested training materials to them or their representatives.
Okay, very comprehensive training requirements. Finally, just ensuring the visibility of lead hazards on the worksite itself is crucial. What are the signage requirements that we need to implement?
Yes, visible warnings are important. The standard mandates that warning signs must be prominently posted in any work area where employee exposure to lead is above the PALA. These signs aren't just any signs. They must have specific prescribed wording. It has to say, danger lead work area, may damage fertility or the unborn child, causes damage to the central nervous system. Do not eat, drink, or smoke in this area. It's also important to ensure that no contradictory or detracting statements are placed on or near these required warning signs. They need to be clear and unambiguous.
Got it. Now, all of these regulations, monitoring, medical training, they clearly generate a significant amount of data and documentation. What are the key record-keeping requirements that employers and safety professionals must adhere to?
You're right. Record keeping is a huge part of compliance here. You are required to maintain accurate records of all exposure monitoring data. This includes the dates of monitoring, the number, duration, and location of samples taken, the results, the sample procedures used, the analytical methods, and critically, any respiratory protection that was worn by the employees being monitored during that sampling. These exposure monitoring records must be kept for a minimum of 30 years.
30 years. Wow.
30 years, yes. And you must also maintain detailed biological monitoring and medical examination records for each employee covered by the standard. These medical records should include the employee's name and identifier, copies of the physician's written opinions, the results of all examinations and tests conducted, any employee medical complaints related to lead exposure, and a copy of the information provided to the physicians. These medical records must be kept for the duration of the employee's employment plus 30 years after they leave.
Duration of employment plus 30 years. Okay.
There is a specific exception for employees who are employed for less than 1 year. In those cases, if they leave, the medical records don't need to be kept for 30 years if they are provided directly to the employee upon termination of employment. You also need to maintain records of any medical removals, documenting the employee's name, the dates of each removal and the return to work, the reason for the removal, including their BLL if applicable, and whether it was a temporary or permanent removal. And finally, remember that objective data we talked about. If you used objective data to exempt yourself from conducting initial exposure monitoring for certain tasks, you must keep detailed records documenting the data itself, why it's relevant, the source, the workplace conditions, etc. The standard also cross-references the General Records Access Standard, 1910.1020 OSHA, which outlines specific requirements for transferring these records if your business changes ownership or ceases to operate.
Okay, extensive record keeping. One last point from the standard. Employees have the right to observe our monitoring activities, don't they?
Yes, that's correct. Employees, or their designated representatives, like a union rep, have the right to observe any lead exposure monitoring that you conduct as the employer. As the employer, you are required to provide these observers with any necessary personal protective equipment they might need to safely enter the area being monitored. And you must ensure that they comply with all applicable safety and health procedures while they are observing.
This has been an incredibly detailed and, I think, really valuable deep dive into the OSHA lead-in construction standard. And thanks again to Safety One Source for bringing this to our audience. It's clear that these are comprehensive and truly critical regulations designed to protect workers from a very real and significant health hazard.
Absolutely. And for all you safety professionals and risk managers listening today, understanding and diligently implementing these requirements. It's not just about legal compliance, is it? It's really fundamental to ensuring the health and well-being of your workforce day in and day out. This deep dive provides, we hope, a crucial overview and clarifies some key points, but we strongly encourage everyone to consult the full OSHA Lead in Construction Standard 1926.62, including all of its appendices. That's where you'll find the complete details and the specific requirements that apply to your unique operations.
Definitely. As you apply this information to your own work situations, remember the importance of proactive measures, that hierarchy of controls, focusing on engineering and work practices first for controlling lead exposure. And if you do have any further questions or need specific clarification on any aspect of the standard, please don't hesitate to reach out to OSHA directly or to consult with qualified safety and health professionals.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we wrap up, maybe just a final thought to lead with our listeners. Let's reflect on the ongoing commitment we all share to worker safety. Staying informed, adapting to evolving regulations and interpretations like the ones we discussed, and consistently implementing best practices. These are continuous responsibilities. They are absolutely essential for protecting the long-term health of everyone working in the construction industry, especially when dealing with insidious hazards like lead.